Il professor Frederick Hargreave terrà ora la sua Lectio Magistralis dal titolo Research is a Team Effort.
Dean, Rector, members of the faculty and visitors, ladies and gentlemen, my friends and colleagues. It is indeed an honor to have this degree. It's the first that I've received. It's an honor that it's granted by a university that goes back over 900 years, with medicine from the beginning of it. And it's quite in contrast to the university I come from, which is very new, like a child in comparison with you, and a faculty of medicine which is only 42 years old. Well, I'm standing here on a podium, and with the Winter Olympic Games just finished, I want to assure you I'm not one of the athletes. I do some exercise, but I'm glad to have the break, because while I have a trainer who's lovely to look at, she's the devil with the intensity of exercise that she tries to make me do. I'd like to say right at the beginning that getting here has involved a lot of help from other people. And what I want to emphasize in this presentation is that research really is a team effort. And as you can read, Isaac Newton said that if I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. I've been very lucky in the giants that have been my mentors. First, Moran Campbell and Norman Jones. Both of these were and are physiologists. I'd like to tell you a little bit about them. Moran Campbell became known for his work on the mechanisms of dyspnea, of shortness of breath, for his work on respiratory failure, the use of controlled oxygen so that when people were in respiratory failure, they didn't get too much and underbreathed and went into coma, and the introduction of a Venturi mask which delivered really very small amounts of oxygen, 24%, 28% and 35% to these people. Norman Jones was an exercise physiologist and propagated the cardiorespiratory exercise test. Both of these introduced me to respiratory medicine. And then they attracted me to McMaster University, which is where I'm still at. They've helped me in my train of thought and in writing, the writing being something that physicians do very poorly, and which is something which research people really need to be taught. Also amongst my giants are Guy Scadding and Jack Pepys. Guy Scadding was a clinical scientist. He was the founding professor of the Institute for Disease of the Chest, which is now the National Heart and Lung Institute in London. He was well known for his work for the diagnosis and treatment of tuberculosis, a condition called sarcoidosis, conditions causing inflammation and a fibrosis, a scarring of the air sacs of the lungs. And also he specifically taught me about how to define a disease, something which over the past 40 years has really been lost and caused confusion amongst people working with diseases like asthma and COPD. Jack Pepys was also a clinical scientist, but in allergy. He propagated the use of the prick technique, just pricking into the skin, for the demonstration of allergy to common things like pollen and molds and so on. He also widened the scope of allergy by studying and identifying mechanisms involved with a condition, an inflammatory condition of the air sacs areas of the lung, caused by particles that are breathed in. One of them was bird fancier's lung, and I think he gave a lecture in Florence where he spoke about this, and then through the lecture he sort of raised up a budgerigard in a cage, which Jack Pepys introduced me to research and gave me some insight into how to interpret the results. And then finally, amongst my giants are Roger Altunian and Jerry Dolovich. Now, Roger Altunian was Armenian. He was sent to school in England. He became known as a child when the author and journalist Arthur Ransom wrote a book entitled Swallows and Amazons. Roger featured in this book, and the first story, in fact, was very biographical. Roger, later in life, discovered the first anti-allergic drug, and he did this by experiments on himself. He also introduced the first powder inhaler, which resulted from his work during the war when he taught low-level flying at night. Roger Altunian, 40 years ago, was using the methods in clinical practice which we use today. The methods are a bit refined, but these methods that he used at that time are still not widely used in clinical practice, although they're extremely useful to ensure that the diagnosis is accurate and the treatment is appropriate. And finally, Jerry Dolovich, my close friend, colleague, also a clinical scientist in allergy. Jerry and I worked closely together, and in receiving this honorary degree, from my own point of view, I will always regard it as something that both Jerry and I received. Unfortunately, he died prematurely from systemic sclerosis. I'd like to turn now to just a few comments about some aspects of research. Identify priorities. This refers particularly to young researchers who've gone through training and are on the hospital staff. When you do clinical science, there is the extra problem to doing basic science, and that is that one has patients to look after. These are easy to handle, they're rewarding, but they can be very demanding and in fact can prevent you getting on any research at all. So one has to make decisions as to what one's priorities are and to repeatedly do this. I was able to get round some of the clinical work by backing out of the in-hospital work and concentrating on outpatients where the things that I was researching were relevant. Focus. Most researchers are not brilliant. And sorry, I've just lost my train of thought. They're not brilliant, and therefore they have to focus on certain areas of research in order to make things happen. So, as you've heard, I've focused on clinical research in disorders of the airways of the lungs. I've even focused down in those into better understanding disease so that diagnosis and treatment can be improved. Health research methods. The methods must be common to any sort of research. One needs to ask a specific and clear question which is based on a hypothesis and a study which is designed to answer the question. It sounds pretty straightforward, but very often in reviewing papers, the authors of the papers haven't been able to do this. And finally, I want to say some words about measurements. These need to be taken seriously, and this hasn't been said any better than Lord Kelvin when he said that when you can measure what you're speaking about and express it in numbers, you know something about it. But when you can't measure it, when you cannot express it in numbers, your knowledge is of a very meager and unsatisfactory kind. The other thing about measurements is that it's no use just getting someone to do the measurements who doesn't have much insight into doing them correctly. So one needs people who have been trained in whatever the measurement is that one's going to make. I think one of the reasons that our own research has often been ahead of many other centres is that we've introduced measurements into clinical practice at a very early stage. What that does is it gives you unexpected observations which can then be taken to formal research studies and studied in detail. So finally, I'm going to show you 3 quotations which relate to new findings. It's always exciting when you have new findings, but if these go against dogma or myths, then these are always suspected and usually opposed without any other reason but because they're not already common. Therefore, one needs to keep an open mind by the researcher who made the observations and introduced a new opinion, and an open mind by reviewers or opponents, because, as James Dewar said, minds are like parachutes. They only function when they're open. However, opposition to new ideas, unfortunately, prevails. What one needs to do is to wait until whatever you've introduced or proposed is validated. Sometimes you can convince opponents to do the sort of things which you've done, and they'll either confirm or refute what you've said. But Max Planck said it more severely. He said, a new science truth doesn't triumph by convincing its opponents, but rather because the opponents die and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it. None of this research is possible without good staff. We've been really fortunate where I've worked because over the last 40 years, 35, 40 years, we've had about 50 really good research physicians in training, and we've had some good technologists. I've listed a few of those here who have become quite prominent. And 4 of them are here today. Ian Pavord, who's a consultant physician in Leicester with the research group, which is probably one of the most prominent in the UK at the moment in the field of airway diseases. Neil Thompson has the chair in respiratory medicine in Glasgow. Paul O'Byrne is the chairman of the Department of Medicine, now in his 2nd term at McMaster University. And Peter Sturck, Peter is the editor of the European Respiratory Journal. You'll notice that Paul is holding up money. He's well off. And that's been to my advantage because on at least a couple of occasions I've got into the red. Unfortunately, Paul has been there to bail me out. And finally, as you've already heard, if one has a family, as I have with 3 children, you can't get by and be productive without having a very supportive wife. And my wife, Alex, she's a lovely person. Unfortunately, she can't be here today. In her stead, my son Peter's come along. I think you're a great person, Peter. Respect you a lot. And thanks for coming. And thank you for listening.